Is Star Trek the Original Series dated? Why does Star Trek the Original Series, or TOS as us fans call it, look so simplistic compared with the other Star Trek series? Well, the short answer is that it was made in the 1960s when special effects technology was limited, but there is more to it than that. Gene Roddenberry believed that his target audience was not stupid, and that if he just made up elements for purely visual purposes, they would probably figure it out. So he stipulated that there should be nothing on the Enterprise which did not serve a purpose. Anyone who is a connoisseur of 20th century sci fi, which, by the way, is when it was at its apex, will notice that Star Trek broke significantly with the common threads and aesthetics of the era. There are no rockets or wall to wall computers with magnetic tape. There are also no flying saucers. It would seem he took care to avoid cliches. More importantly, however, Gene Roddenberry was attempting to guess what could be in the future. What would it take to go 10 times the speed of light? Obviously, rocket engines aren't going to do it. What kind of power source is needed? It's hard to say, but probably something with a greater output than nuclear fission, and probably something that utilizes space more efficiently inside the ship. I've seen people express contempt for the look of Star Trek the original series, saying that it's technologically outdated and therefore acceptable to revise it at the expense of canon. To be fair, it would seem that Gene Roddenberry failed to anticipate touchscreens, for example, but I believe that Gene Roddenberry was a greater genius than he knew, and probably more than most people suspect. But, you might ask, we have touchscreens now, so shouldn't they have touchscreens in the future? First of all, Star Trek is not the future. It's an alternate future. We are already past the point in the real world where our timeline has diverged from the Star Trek canon timeline. In the Star Trek timeline, they have the eugenics war in the 1990s, but in our world, instead of Khan Noonien Singh, we have Saved by the Bell and Steve Urkel. The 90s was a great time in real life, whereas in the Star Trek timeline, it was a horrific nightmare, which probably would have elicited a dark age. But even with a dark age, and with having fought wars we have not, they should still have touchscreens in this alternate timeline, but they aren't incorporated into the ships or any of the standard gear. Why not? This is the point where I have to fill in for what has not been stated, and this is where we also get to the point where I would say some of Gene Roddenberry's unconscious or inadvertent genius was at play. Now, I recognize that I have no authority to add to the canon, but if there is ever an attempt to make new Star Trek content in the original timeline, the makers should take note of this. The Federation was created as an alliance of multiple alien planets coming together, actually surrendering their sovereignty to some degree, and forming a new union with a central government. After the political bonds are formed, the next thing they have to do is create a combined fleet, and that would require uniformity and standardization. The first issue to be resolved is to decide what operating system to use. At the very least, each planet would have one unique computer system with its own language. In fact, in our timeline, Earth has at least two computer systems, PCs and Macs. When I was young, a program made for Apple could not be installed on a PC, and vice versa. Later on, Apple decided to make PC compatible software, but this has more to do with marketing and economics than any consideration of which system was better. So it's possible that some of the alien worlds might have multiple computer systems which are not compatible with one another, much less with totally alien systems from other planets. When it comes to the formation of the Federation, I imagine that the Vulcans probably would have had the best computer system, but it doesn't automatically follow that everyone else would want to use it, regardless of how powerful and superior it was. In fact, most cultures would probably want to retain their own computer systems because switching would complicate matters on their planet. Also, everyone else would be at the mercy of the Vulcans as they would, for a time, be the only computer experts who understand the dominant system. The easiest and most logical solution would be to allow the experts from all the member worlds to create an entirely new computer system, which would be more advanced than any of the original systems of the member worlds. They could imbue the new system with interfaces to allow it to receive data from the old systems, as data would be the only thing really worth bringing over. While designing the new system, they would make it as simple as possible because they are going to have to mass produce it for the new fleet of ships. They would also need to make it durable because the ships will be going faster and farther than ever before. There's a good deal of shaking and jolting in TOS, as well as in the later series. So it would make sense that they might revert to physical buttons and controls, as they are not only more durable but also cheaper to produce. By the time period of the original Star Trek movies, they do have touchscreens, but we can think of this as the logical progression of technology from the basic universal systems they would have designed after the Federation was formed. But what about the uniforms, you ask? Don't they look silly? As to that, I have to say that's a subjective value judgment. To me, the uniforms don't look silly, but they do look basic. Each culture that merged into the Federation would have had its own uniforms, heraldry, and ranking systems. The easiest way to accommodate everyone would be to start over with a new system. While designing the new uniforms, care would have to be taken to avoid violating taboos. Given the circumstances, a basic design for uniforms would be the most likely outcome. It's worth noting that the uniforms have no armor and that the security men all wear red. This may not seem the logical development based on the way our military looks today, but I assure you that it is logical. To illustrate my point, we must return to the history of our own world. In our world, the earliest forms of armor were made of leather and or bronze. The ability to work iron, and later steel, allowed for the creation of better weapons and armor. As in all times, a balance had to be struck between protection and mobility, so the earliest forms of armor prioritized covering the areas which were most likely to be targeted. As both melee and distance weapons improved, more armor was needed and better. The classic Roman armor, which often appears in movies and comics, gave way to mail armor, and it did so, actually, before the collapse of the Roman Empire. Eventually, the mail armor came to cover most of the body. With the advent of the crossbow, more armor was needed, and ultimately the entire body was covered, mostly in heavy plates. The invention of guns made this heavy armor obsolete and cumbersome. Granted, the first guns were not particularly accurate and could not fire many shots, so during the early days of the gun, much of the combat still involved melee. Rather than completely discarding armor, less armor was worn. During the 1500s and 1600s, it was common for soldiers to wear a breastplate and helmet, but not much more than that. The breastplate and helmet were intended to protect against swords, but not guns. A man in full armor would still be more formidable in melee combat, but if I have a gun that can only fire one shot, and after that I have to engage in melee combat, then I am going to use that gun to take out the most threatening enemy first. As guns continue to improve, all armor is eventually discarded. Throughout the 1700s and 1800s, there is no armor, but there is also no camouflage either. The purpose of the uniforms is to differentiate your troops from the enemy, which, unfortunately, also means that you are painting a target on your own troops. During World War I, protective helmets come into use, but this was more for the purpose of stopping shrapnel than stopping a bullet. Camouflage also became more common, too late in my opinion. But World War I is also the first mechanized war, so new steps had to be taken to protect the men. As we go forward, camouflage becomes better, and eventually armor is created which can stop certain kinds of bullets. It is entirely possible that in our future, full body armor will come back into use. So to sum it up, the pattern is basically thus: new weapon, new defense, new weapon to respond to the new defense to respond to the new weapon, and so on and so forth. Now, getting back to Star Trek, The advent of phasers would make the bulletproof body armor obsolete. The phaser can just disintegrate it, or on a lower setting, it could heat the armor and boil the man inside. The weapons in TOS are all energy based, and they don't seem to generate much shrapnel. So there really isn't a situation where armor would be useful. As for camouflage, the widely varying color schemes of the alien planets they visit would make it difficult to create any sort of standard pattern. The best type of camouflage would be a cloaking device, and the best form of defense a personal force field generator. But of course, it would take a while for these technologies to develop. If camouflage is needed, we typically see the crew of the Enterprise dressing in local costume. As for the use of red by security personnel, it's worth noting that in our world the English took over a large portion of it and ruled for hundreds of years while their soldiers wore bright red. Granted, wearing red paints a target on the soldiers as it clashes terribly with the natural environment here on Earth, but it can also be intimidating as it represented the power and authority of the English Empire. Those soldiers were also backed up by cannons, warships, and mounted soldiers. Their reputation preceded them so much that most people would think twice before taking out one of their soldiers. The Romans also wore red, but I am fairly certain the purpose of that was to make it more difficult for enemies to notice if their soldiers were bleeding. To be sure, that is a significant advantage. I suspect that Gene Roddenberry may have been mindful of this, even if it were at the subconscious level. It is true that not all the Federation personnel bleed red, but we also do not see any Vulcans employed in security, which would be a waste of their talents. It's also worth noting that during the movie period, with the exception of Star Trek I, all uniforms are red. It seems to me that the TOS era Federation is at a stage of development where personal gear has yet to catch up with the power of the weapons, and the Federation's greatest opponents are in a similar position. It's an echo of the 1800s, where the main purpose of the uniforms is to indicate rank and alliance, and to announce one's presence rather than conceal it. It's also worth noting that most of the combat occurs in space between ships. When troops are sent down, it's usually for protection, a show of force, or occupation. In later series, we see some cultures equipped with personal force fields, like the Borg, armor, like the Klingons, and personal cloaking devices, like the Jem'Hadar. The Klingons of the TNG period, of course, wear armor because of their preference for melee combat. That preference is an outgrowth of their religion, but they are also practical and use modern weaponry, and of course, the armor affords them no protection against that. Interestingly, the Borg seem to have developed a vulnerability to melee combat, as their main focus was on protecting against whatever weapons are the most powerful. As I mentioned earlier, there is the issue of taboos, which may also account for the appearance of simplicity in other areas, that is, beyond the uniforms, of course. When different cultures are brought together and come to share a common authority structure and living space, it becomes inevitable that taboos will be violated because the amount of unknown taboos increases. In other words, the more the cultures, the greater the chance of giving and taking offense. This could be why the food in TOS looks so basic and contrived. So, coming to the issue of food, one man's sacred animal might be another man's dinner, or one man's pet may be another man's dinner. For that matter, one man's vermin may be another man's dinner. Some religions require their practitioners to avoid all types of animals that have certain physical characteristics. If you go to an Indian restaurant, you might notice that neither pork nor beef are served, typically. In India, the largest religion is Hinduism, which forbids the consumption of beef. The second largest religion is Islam, which forbids the consumption of pork. As a result, both items were removed from normal Indian cuisine. Two different cultures sharing a common country has led to the production of a common menu that both can eat. After all, it's easier to take those items off than to constantly make special accommodations for exceptions. So producing a menu for a vast array of alien cultures would be a more difficult matter. In addition to whatever Earth cultures might be present in the Star Trek timeline, it's also established that Vulcans are vegetarian. As for the other alien cultures, it's not specified what restrictions they might have, but they must have at least some. In addition to that, there should also be dietary restrictions due to what the different species can metabolize. We are, after all, talking about different species. On Earth, all the animal life forms which bleed and have blood bleed red, and are part of the same food chain as humans. Yet we cannot all eat the same things in all cases. A human might eat chocolate without issues, but it's toxic for dogs. When it comes to alien life, and particularly life forms with different colored blood, you would have to take care in arranging the menu. So, what sort of food can you serve? Before creating a menu, you would have to take an inventory of all the taboos, as well as the nutritional requirements. Something very basic and cost efficient would have to be produced, and it may end up being synthetic food cubes. I do realize that on some occasions the senior officers were able to eat other things such as salad and soup, but one would expect the senior officers to have special privileges and dispensations. It's worth noting that in the episode Journey to Babel, the wide array of ambassadors has a very limited amount of food items to choose from. Really, this is how it would have to be for all the reasons I have stated. In the TNG era, the rations are replaced by replicators, so people are able to eat whatever they want at the individual level, and we don't see the food cubes anymore. So, in conclusion, I would just reiterate that there is no reason to disregard the canon. It is still viable and it is foundational. I didn't mean for this entry to get as long as it did, but I think I was able to hit on some interesting cultural topics. So, if you made it this far, thanks for watching.